Do any of you Thomas fans remember Trainboy 54? You know, that guy who had a Thomas and Friends Playrail Trackmaster series where characters from Disney Channel's Phineas and Ferb were turned into Thomas engines, as well as, you know, this video.
He's Phineas and Ferb's best friend, you know. All of the others will tell you so. He helps Phineas and Ferb.
Yeah, that guy. The man himself, John McDowell, is quite the rabbit hole. So much that I made a video about the guy nearly 2 years ago! Are you kidding me? Looking back on it, I had a blast making that video, and it's one of my favorite videos I've certainly done. Not only brushing up on the history and my own personal experience with the guy, but also some great and new additional information from his friend and fellow collaborator, Ackley Attack TV, who would also help me with a few videos after that. Also around that time a few years ago, I actually made my own versions of these designs using my old art style, which, looking back, has aged about as gracefully as spilled milk. But now that I'm in college, have improved my art, my craft and skill, and hopefully know what I'm doing a little bit more, I figured I'd revisit them. So today, we're taking another look at the Danville Locos, Trainboy 54's wonderfully bizarre Thomas and Friends / Phineas and Ferb mashup customs. Phineas Flynn was naturally the first one I designed. The original toy was basically a Thomas repaint with the boys' triangular heads slapped onto the front, so I wanted to keep the general idea while making him feel a bit more like an actual Thomas locomotive. In the show, Phineas is an optimistic, creative, and extremely talented kid who spends every summer day building some ridiculous invention with his stepbrother Ferb, only for it to disappear by the end of the episode, thanks to Doofenshmirtz or whatever other nonsense was happening that day. Interestingly, that optimism contrasts with Thomas pretty well. Both are friendly and enthusiastic, but Thomas is much more cheeky and prone to getting himself in trouble, while Phineas is much more upbeat and always determined with what he's got going on. So I imagine Phineas being the guy constantly encouraging Thomas while Thomas is usually busy trying to prove how useful he is. For the redesign, I kept this blue wheels and orange on white color scheme based on John's custom, but made them an American tank engine, specifically an 060 Baldwin dock tank. British tank engines are already incredibly common in the Thomas fandom, so I wanted to spice things up a bit. Despite that Yank influence, I gave him British buffers and couplings to help Phineas fit alongside the international engines on the show, like Hero, Ashima, Nia, or the already American Logging Locos. While I'm not a particular fan of this approach in terms of realism, I did this specifically for the Danville Locos to make it clear they work on Sodor despite coming from America, to match Trainboy 54's video series on their origins coming from Danville. Think how Porter, Philip, or Timothy operate on Sodor, despite coming from the States. And lo and behold, here's Phineas. On the topic of American engines, I know I said I wouldn't use British tank engines, but, well, I lied about that. But there's actually a reason for it. One thing I wanted to do with these designs was make the locomotive choices on my retakes reflect the characters' backgrounds. Ferb and his father Lawrence are British, while Phineas and Candace Flynn are American through their mother Linda. So naturally, I thought Ferb should retain some of that British heritage. His design is based on a Barclay 040 tank engine, which I thought suited his quiet and hardworking personality, while still vaguely looking like Percy's saddle tank engine shape that John chose. One thing you might notice is that for these engines, I'm adding the text DNTSR, standing for Danville and Tri-State Railroad. In the original Trainboy 54 videos, these engines are just simply called the Danville Locos, as you know, they're obviously from the Tri-State area, so I figured I'd give them an actual proper railway to come from. Another oddity is John using a blue and cream color palette instead of Ferb's usual purple and cream, so I fixed that here. My idea is that Ferb was originally brought over to America to work on the Tri-State area before eventually being sent to Sodor for temporary reasons. So after spending some time in the States, he's practically returned to his natural habitat. And personality-wise, I think Ferb would fit Sodor pretty well. He's quiet, intelligent, and lets his actions do most of the talking. However, there is a Trainboy 54 video where he's shown getting competitive with Thomas over delivering people to a barbecue, so I'd give him a little more edge here. Thomas can brag about being really useful engine all he wants, but Ferb will just quietly prove him wrong. He'd still be Phineas' brother-in-arms, or wheels I guess, helping him out with whatever ideas he wants to do today in regards to getting work done. Also, for some reason, that Trainboy 54 video about the barbecue has a reference to Abbott and Costello, and the exact use of the joke here was ripped directly from a Miss Oliver and Blossom Thomas video, which, I don't know, just watch my Trainboy 54 video to know more about that. And now, here's Ferb! Next up on the chopping block is Candace, the overeager and slightly cocky older teenage sister. Naturally, her original Trackmaster counterpart was a James repaint, so I wanted to keep that basic idea while making her feel like an actual locomotive. Finding a suitable 260 mogul took a little while. I initially considered using an older design, which you can see in my old sketch of Candace, but then I remembered that Phineas' locomotive design is based on a Baldwin, so I figured Candace should be a mogul from the same general family. It gives the siblings a bit of locomotive history connecting them. I also took some inspiration from one of John's Candace models by making the tender white, which I think is meant to loosely represent her skirt. It's a pretty goofy solution in that sense, but honestly, this Phineas and Ferb Thomas mashup, go with it. Usually within the source material, Candace is extremely protective of her brothers and constantly tries to bust them, in quotations, whenever they do something dangerous or ridiculous, in quotations. That aspect wasn't really explored in the original Trainboy 54 Trackmaster videos, so if I were writing Candace as a Thomas character, I'd keep that trait intact. Instead of trying to prove Phineas and Ferb's inventions exist to Linda, she'd constantly be making sure her brothers aren't doing something that could cause an accident on the railway. Some, like Duck, would consider her inattentive, some, like Thomas, would find her horribly brash, and some, like Toby or Emily, would see Candace as someone who truly needs validation and mental support. In a similar fashion to Stacy, and Vanessa during the events of Season 5, one of the engines that could help with Candace's insecurities and frustrations would be Mavis, who would blend right in with the female Danville Locos persona-wise. She could potentially end up sharing same interests as them and give Candace pep talks regarding her over-controlling nature. And honestly, I think she'd also get reasonably along well with James. They're both proud, dramatic, and very eager to make sure everyone knows what they're doing. Of course, there'll be some moments in between where James would butt heads with Candace at his lowest points, but his own bragging was more insufferable than Candace was ever known to be sometimes. Here's Candace! With the original custom being a lady repaint and Isabella being Mexican, my pool of options for a suitable tank engine were very limited. There aren't exactly a ton of Mexican industrial tank engines that conveniently look like lady. Eventually, I settled on National de Tehuantepec 060ST number 507. Sorry if I might have butchered that for you Mexican viewers in the audience. The wheel arrangement isn't quite right, but the cab and overall proportions were close enough to ladies to make it work. Sometimes you just have to squint at a locomotive and say, yeah, that'll do. For the colors, I usually color pick directly from the Phineas and Ferb cartoon to keep her recognizable, while still keeping the general layout from John McDowell's original custom. I also kept the black running board and silver buffers, partially to mimic Lady's original Trackmaster chassis, which was mostly left unpainted on the toy, leaving it black and gold. I also kept the Fireside Girls emblem on her side as a little homage to her as the group's leader in the Phineas and Ferb universe. But in the Thomas universe, Isabella runs the Fireside logging camp, making her a diligent and resourceful little logging engine, bossing around and managing a bunch of smaller, narrow-gauge engines that run the line. And given how Isabella is famously crushing on Phineas, I imagine that hasn't changed here either. Phineas probably absolutely has no idea. If anything, I don't think John actually made that part of her character in his series, though I could be wrong. And given how prepared and gung-ho Isabella is, her driver and fireman could have extra tools in her cap to help accomplish the hardest railroad duties. John also made customs of the other Fireside Girls as narrow gauge engines, so if there's enough demand, I may revisit them eventually, because apparently I've now reached the point where I'm making an entire railway out of Phineas and Ferb characters. And now, here's Isabella! Baljeet is the only narrow gauge engine in this batch, mainly because his original custom was a repaint of Sir Handel, and I didn't want to miss out on him for the main Phineas and Ferb characters. So naturally, I had to find another narrow gauge engine that could fit the bill. I settled on a Darjeeling Himalayan Railway tank engine, which some Cars fans may recognize as the basis for Pramat from the Plane spin-off movie. And honestly, it fits Baljeet pretty well and vaguely looks like Sir Handel if you squint. In Phineas and Ferb, Baljeet is the resident nerd. Extremely intelligent, academically driven, and usually the guy you want around when something has gone horribly wrong. Sort of the unsung hero of the group. One thing I felt John's original series didn't really take advantage of was that personality. As mentioned in my original Trainboy 54 video, a lot of his episodes basically reused plots from actual Thomas stories without really adapting them to the Phineas and Ferb cast, which I do feel that it's either confusing or feels out of place. So if I were to rewrite Trainboy 54's Baljeet, I'd actually use his intelligence. He'd work around the Skarloey Railway, hauling goods from the wharf to the Blue Mountain Quarry, solving problems that the more hard-headed engines constantly get themselves into. For example, basically Duncan would break something, and Baljeet would spend 5 minutes explaining why he broke it. Duncan would then immediately break something else. On the other hand, if Baljeet had a mental breakdown over conflicts with his schedule or even social skills, Duncan or any other narrow gauge engines would help him in return. Side note, he'd probably still be into space adventure like his actual counterpart, through watching from his driver's TV set when he has a break. Anyway, here's Baljeet! Buford was probably the easiest train to figure out. Since the original custom used Salty as his basis, I went with an Alco RS-1, which vaguely looks like a really long salty if you squint hard enough, and I mean really hard. In fact, it just kinda looks like that one wooden railway salty prototype with the elongated chassis. Honestly, Buford's personality doesn't need much changing. He's tough, brash, competitive, and occasionally a bit of a bully, but ultimately at the end of the day, he has a very good heart, or engine in this case. I'd keep that dynamic here, particularly with Baljeet. Since Baljeet works on a narrow gauge railway, Buford would constantly pick on him for being the smaller engine. Of course, Baljeet is also significantly smarter than him, so Buford has the size advantage while Baljeet has literally everything else. At the same time, he wouldn't get along with the average bully diesel either. His more unconventional interests, like whatever the Thomas equivalent to having life-sized molds of his friends would be, or even the fact he'd make friends with the steamers he used to bully, like good or Dinner Bell, would warrant odd looks from Diesel, Diesel 10, and such. On a side note, a character I decided to omit from this video from Phineas's friend group that Trainboy 54 made into a custom is Django, who barely appeared in the show. A Toby repaint I purely cut for the sake of time and for this video to focus more on PNF's more major characters. If I make a part 2, surely you can expect that Danville tram to appear. And now, here's Buford! Here we have Stacy, Candace's best friend and the person who probably has to deal with her nonsense regularly. In Trainboy 54 series, Stacy was represented by Emily, who's a sterling stingle and is described to be that in the show. Trainboy 54's show, I mean. Since I wanted to give her a unique basis to match the character's background, I instead used the Japanese Government Railways Class 8620 as her basis. The wheel arrangement isn't completely accurate to Emily, but the overall look worked well enough, and I gave her Stacy's blue color scheme. I also made the blue considerably lighter than John's original custom, which was much darker. Personality-wise, Stacy is one of the more grounded characters in the group. She's Candace's best friend, and usually tries to look out after her. Even when Candace's obsessive attempts to keep Phineas and Ferb out of trouble inevitably spiral into complete utter nonsense. I mostly remember Trainboy 54 Stacy from the short Date Night, where she and Percy go on, you guessed it, a date night. A date that has Thomas, Buford, and Candace attempt to ruin it for some reason with a battleship. And if you've seen the video, you might recognize that the premise is basically lifted from a Homestar Runner episode beat for beat, amongst plenty of others mentioned. Because this series wasn't content with being a Thomas and Friends and Phineas and Ferb crossover, it basically needed Homestar Runner too. Actually, I think the idea of seeing Homestar Runner characters as Thomas characters does sound concerning, but you know, I'd prefer the cartoony approach of just them appearing in crossover land. I think this version of Stacy, like her canon self at times, wouldn't always be the most focused when it comes to taking certain complicated jobs from Sir Topham Hatt. Still, she truly shines in her social skills and sense of visual presentation, making her the first to give analytical critiques on a new livery an engine would be given, or a meditator apiece for certain engines. She wouldn't be 100% not guilty of annoying the other engines, either if she and Candace were squealing obsessively over their favorite band, or even their respective crushes coming to Sodor, disturbing the other engine's peace in the process. Anyway, here's Stacy! Not to be confused with Thomas's talking airplane, Jeremy was one of the harder designs to figure out retroactively. His original basis in John's custom was a green artery paint, and trying to find an American equivalent proved surprisingly difficult. Eventually, I settled on a 266 tank engine from the States. It's obviously not a 262 like Arthur, but the general shape worked well enough for what I was going for. Sometimes historical accuracy has to take the back seat when you're trying to make a green train based on a Disney cartoon character. Jeremy first appeared in the Thomas Trackmaster videos paired alongside Trevor the Traction Engine of all characters. And when he did show up with the Phineas and Ferb characters, he barely interacted with Candace despite being the guy she has a crush on in the actual show. Which feels like a big missed opportunity. If I were expanding the series, I'd definitely give Jeremy a bigger role and actually have him interact with Candace. You know, maybe give her an excuse to spend 5 minutes desperately trying to act normal around him. She would fail spectacularly when they eventually start dating, since, well, the question of how engine romance works would definitely be the main elephant in Henry's tunnel worth addressing. I suppose what would constitute a date would be Candermy double-heading an excursion train to a popular tourist spot or alongside a scenic route? Maybe? On his respective Sodor visit, I'd like to think he would go to Ulfstead Castle and attend a medieval jousting reenactment, which got him into fantasy fiction, just to tie into his interest in live-action role-playing, or LARPing as the kids say, from Candace Against the Universe onwards. And now, here's Jeremy! For some reason, Vanessa is in love with Thomas in the series, which is, certainly a decision. Her original custom was a play rail stepney with Thomas's body, which you can identify from the 2 headlamps mounted on the front running board. Using that as my starting point, I went with a German 010O tank engine with 2 headlamps for her redesign, partly to reflect her family's vaguely European origins, given that Drusselstein is loosely based on Germany, so it felt appropriate. I also think Vanessa has some untapped potential in the series. Despite being closely associated with Thomas in the Trackmaster videos, there's surprisingly little material involving her and her father, Heinz Doofenshmirtz, despite the fact he already has a custom. Their father-daughter dynamic could translate pretty well into the Thomas universe. Vanessa would still be fairly independent and unimpressed by their dad's antics, while Doof would desperately try to make her happy despite having no idea how to do it. Which, honestly, is the most Doofenshmirtz thing imaginable. Oh yeah, I think she'd still be a god. Not to say all gods worship Satan, most god girls in animation are a clear sign, but considering the connection to Satanism the Standing Stones and Kildane have, there could be a possibility there's some community of gods that live there, so that Vanessa could potentially connect with them the most out of all people on Sodor. And now, here's Vanessa! And finally, we have the comical mad scientist himself, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz. Or Heinz, as he's just called in the Trainboy 54 videos. You might notice that he's a diesel with some sort of external valve gear, which isn't exactly as ridiculous as it sounds, I swear. His basis is the German DRG class V120, a diesel hydraulic locomotive that was powerful, but also notoriously inefficient. In other words, it's basically perfect. I also established that the same company operates both Doof and Vanessa, Doofenshmirtz Railroading Incorporated! Because apparently even mad scientists need a corporate structure. Maybe Love Muffin could be part of it, I don't know. In John's videos, Doofenshmirtz is just mostly there. His biggest acts of villainy usually involve doing something like trying to pull freight cars wrongly and immediately getting himself into trouble. Yes, really. The only instance where we do get to see Doofenshmirtz in John's videos where he acts as he does in the original show was in both parts of the Christmas special, Isabella's Nutcracker, where he's portrayed as his own take on the Mouse King, like how it was in the source material. Which one? I don't know. I guess any version of the Nutcracker story, which admittedly fits well with his character. And this is where I think the original Trackmaster Thomas series missed out on the biggest opportunity with the Phineas and Ferb cast. The characters are there, but their personalities aren't really being used. If I were writing Doofenshmirtz, I'd let him actually be a proper cartoon villain. He'd come up with increasingly stupid schemes to inconvenience the other engines, pull some ridiculous railway themed narrator probably, and explain his entire backstory to whoever happens to be standing nearby, and then have the entire plan immediately backfire on his face. Think CGI era Diesel with more weaponry readily available at his disposal. Because if you're gonna put Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz on Sodor, you might as well let them be Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz. And now, here's Dr. Doofenshmirtz. So there we have it. The main Danville Locos from Trainboy 54's Tommy Trackmaster Thomas and Friends series, now hopefully looking a little more like actual characters and a little less like some amateur custom maker who just discovered acrylic paint. Maybe with a lot more hard work and effort on John's part, I think they'll be more convincing to help understand them and see what the tri-state area, let alone Danville, would be like serving their own railway network to work on before coming to Sodor, which, hey, given what we got in John's videos from past to present, is, you know what it is. I had an absolute blast redesigning these guys and trying to turn some of the questionable customs into characters that could actually exist within the Thomas universe. There's definitely more I could do with this concept, especially with some of the other Phineas and Ferb characters, John adapted or not adapted, so who knows, maybe we'll revisit Danville someday. But for now, who's your favorite redesign? Let me know down below! And a huge shout out to Steam Powered Cyborg and Ackley Attack TV for helping me out with the writing process and serving as my resident Phineas and Ferb consultants. You can check their stuff out with the links provided in the description box below. Also, huge thank you to the Trainboy54 himself for providing me good HD images of the Danville Locos. Anyway, this has been Wax World. Like, comment, ring that bell, and subscribe. And most importantly of all, stay wacky! He's the best. He's the best. He's a friend to all of us that we adore. He's the best. He's their best friend. Trainboy 54.